Marx recognized that free trade, as proposed by the partisans, would effectively lead to the increase of the productive forces, to the increase of productive capital. The process of capitalist accumulation, the inversion of surplus value in productive capital, in constant and variable capital, leads to the increase of production and subsequently to the concentration and centralization of capital. This economic course, likewise, is the development of social relations, the growth of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The process is accompanied by competition among capitalists, which leads to the centralization of capital through the destruction of entrepreneurs. Also, it produces greater division of labor and use of machinery. The special skill of the worker is ended and qualified work is replaced by an activity that any worker can execute. Competition between the workers, the industrial reserve army, increases, and thus wages and living conditions decrease and the workload for all grows. Enormous productivity and overproduction of commodities lead to cyclical crises, decapitalization and unemployment, mergers, centralization, monopolization and the increase of the working population, and thus the process of capital accumulation continues. And, if this process occurs in a nation, then it is forced to continue developing from the world market, spurred on by the need to give more and more outlet to its products. The bourgeoisie travels the whole world. It needs to nest everywhere, settle everywhere, create bonds everywhere. 36. For Marx, although the feverish activity of capital was more favorable to the worker, in any case the situation of the workers was a dead end. If capital remains stationary, industry will not be stationary, but will retreat, and the first victim of it will be the worker. He will succumb before the capitalist. And if capital increases, that is, what is considered the most favorable case for the worker, what will be the fate of the worker? It will perish. 237. He knew that the development of the productive forces with free trade would lead to phases of animation, prosperity, and productive boom, but this would inevitably lead to a phase of crisis, of decline, and stagnation of production, which necessarily had to destroy the invested capital. It is destroyed to the extent that capital is inactive and by the decline in commodity prices. Only after this could the crisis phase be traced back and again continue as the natural change of the seasons. 38. Free trade and industrial development would lead to productive crises, always accompanied or preceded by commercial, monetary, and financial crises as an expression of the overproduction of commodities, which would become more frequent and more violent, more destructive of capital, which in the long run would develop the productive forces. It is a dialectical process of development, destruction, development of capital, in an upward spiral. From the above, Marx explained the British pauperism, and, therefore, that of any country, regardless of free trade or protectionism. Pauperism increases and decreases as the periods of stagnation and prosperity alternate. 39. Free trade led to a greater exploitation of the working class, to the extent that the productive forces and capital grew, being the most favorable condition, while protectionism, being unable to continue developing the economic system, did not develop the proletariat or bourgeoisie, maintained the obsolete structures of pre-industrial capitalism and in this sense was an obstacle to development. Marx was a revolutionary who recognized and praised the impetus that free trade would give to capitalism, not because it brought profit to the workers, but because the development of the productive forces would lead to the expropriation of the expropriators, or as Engels says, it is well known that we do not sympathize with the bourgeoisie. But, this time, we sponsor his triumph, because his victory will give his definitive conformation to the world. And yet, nothing more evident than what they do is to open the way everywhere to us, to the Democrats and Communists. 40. To reach socialism one had to go through the development of industrial capitalism and the growth and organization of the communist proletariat. That was the approach of the classics of Marxism. 40 years after Marx had spoken out in favor of free trade, Engels wrote a foreword to the American edition of Protectionism and Free Trade, in which he takes up the fundamental principles and outlines the situation of both systems in Europe and the United States. From 1848 to 1866 there was an enormous boom in industry and commerce in England, largely due to the elimination of protective tariffs on raw materials and foodstuffs. Even the most exaggerated hopes of subsequent prosperity seemed to be fulfilled. 41 Contributing to this boom were the discoveries and exploitation of the gold mines of California and Australia, the world's largest increase in means of exchange, the development of means of transport such as rail and steamships. Countries, such as France, developed internally with protective tariffs and import bans. Switzerland was in total free trade and with a strong industrial development. Germany developed the industry with much more liberal tariffs than in other European countries. America protected itself with tariffs. The United States, in the 1880s, was discussing free trade, after remaining in protectionism beginning with the Civil War of 1861. For Engels it was necessary for the United States to become an industrial country so as not to be eternally condemned to barbarism and submission as an agricultural country. 15 years before writing the aforementioned prologue, he proposed the following alternative: for America to become an industrial country and have all the prospects, not only of reaching this path, but of defeating its rivals in it, it has two ways to follow, or, it maintains free trade, if you want for 50 years, in a very costly fight of competition against English industry, which takes him about 100 years of advantage, or by means of protective tariffs, it discards English competition, say for 25 years, with the almost absolute certainty that, at the end of this same time, American industry will assert its place in the open world market. Engels believed that this last route was the most convenient, and by that time, at the end of the 25 years, he thought that protectionism should have done its work, to a greater or lesser extent, becoming a superfluous system, in such a way that if then it introduced free trade, I am sure that in 10 years it will have reached England on the world market. 42.